you seem to be having all the components of a perfect storm this summer. And what the police are really concerned about, and what the government is increasingly concerned about, is that we could be heading back to a situation that we last found ourselves in 2011.
Lots of news overnight, more violence in Sunderland following the stabbings in Southport. And basically the Prime Minister and other members of the government have been making their views about this heard. What's likely to be the political ramifications here?
Yeah, so as you say, Hugo, there has been swift condemnation again from the government this morning. We've had Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, again condemning the violence by far-right protesters in Sunderland and the attacks on the police, which we've seen yet more police vehicles set on fire in Sunderland, and in fact I think a police station was set on fire too. I'm not sure what we can expect from the Prime Minister today. I have asked that question, but I think that at the moment the government is just carefully monitoring what's going on and waiting to see what happens, because we have to remember that we've had several days now of clashes in more and more cities, and today and over the weekend we're expecting several dozen more demonstrations, including in cities such as Liverpool, Leeds, Bristol and Nottingham. And I think those areas I just mentioned are of particular concern to the police, that there could be an escalation of violence in those cities. In Cardiff, for example, this morning, South Wales Police have already issued a dispersal order. Now, the bigger picture here is that what started off as a terrible atrocity in Southport is quickly morphing into very ugly and widespread disorder. And this is the concern that Keir Starmer has, and why he had a summit in Downing Street with police chiefs earlier this week, because the fear among the police is that all of this is starting to turn. You seem to be having all the components of a perfect storm this summer. And what the police are really concerned about, what the government is increasingly concerned about, is that we could be heading back to a situation that we last found ourselves in 2011, which was obviously sparked by the London riots, and this quickly spread. So what the government is trying to do at the moment is try to get to grips with this and to make sure that there is as high a deterrence as possible to prevent that from happening. So over the next few days, you're going to see a significant police presence in a lot of these areas where these demonstrations are happening. Police forces are coordinating with one another. We're seeing kind of surge capacity in certain areas so that police forces from one force can spill into another city if they're needed. And we've also got lots of prosecutors from the CPS who are on standby should they need to make lots and lots of arrests, and therefore these people need to be charged and put in front of a court. So that's the reaction so far. But as I said, there is some concern that this could continue to escalate.
Yeah, well, I mean, because obviously, although these are largely sort of far-right based rallies at the moment, there will be counter-protests, and this could kind of lead in any particular direction. On a sheer sort of, how to put this, a sheer political level, do you think there is a worry in the government and Starmer and his team that he could become sort of his government could become a particular sort of focus point of hate I mean, because we've seen this sort of rising far-right tendency in Britain over a few years, often linked first to sort of anti-lockdown protests, anti-COVID protests, with an element of sort of anti-immigration protests thrown in. But it's never been it's never been that cohesive. It's always been quite sporadic, never been that focused. Is there a worry among now that we have a Labour government that will be doing things like pushing up taxes, for example, and particularly one that increasingly seems to likely to have almost ironically, a focus on law and order, that actually this could become a real thing, a real sort of trend for running battles against the government?
I think so. I think there's there is potentially a risk there, because I think the things that we're seeing from Labour in terms of policy will be exploited, I think, by certain individuals on the far right to stoke these divisions. For example, Labour is obviously taking a much softer approach, more moderate approach on immigration to the last government, and you can totally see a scenario where certain individuals, the likes of Tommy Robinson, would try and exploit that, and so that is a concern, and I've actually spoken to people who think that. But I think the key for Keir Starmer is that he's confident. I mean, we have to remember that Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions in 2011, so he is well equipped and he has all the requisite experience to deal with this situation. I think what he wants to demonstrate is that his government's in control, They have a plan to deal with this stuff, and they absolutely will not tolerate this violence. The question is whether that's enough and whether these people can actually be deterred. Now, it did work in 2011. The rioting did stop, and there was a very robust response from law enforcement and the courts. But before that happened, there was obviously incredibly widespread violence and rioting.
Yeah, indeed. Well, look, turning to other political matters, The Times today has a story by Stephen Swinford and Aubrey Alleghetti about Labour plans to destroy the Tories for good. What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So this is a really interesting insight that the Times have given us today about how Starmer is approaching the first stages of his government. And effectively what this piece does is it tells us that he's not resting on his laurels. I mean, he has the second largest Labour majority in history, but he is not complacent. And that he has good reason not to be complacent because, people forget that Labour won 410 seats, but with only 35% of the vote, which is actually what that means is that it's electoral coalition, the voters that put them into Downing Street. It's a very wide and broad coalition, but it's also very fragile and shallow. And so what Keir Starmer is thinking about is we need to, from day one, we need to try and build on, not just rely on our base. We need to try and constantly expand and prove to those people that didn't vote for us that next time around they should be. Now, what the Labour government seems to think at this moment in time is that actually the reason why their vote share was so low is because a lot of people just wanted to vote to get the Conservatives out, and therefore people who would have otherwise voted Labour in a lot of places voted for the Lib Dems and the Greens. And now that Labour is the dominant force in British politics, they think that as long as they continue to deliver and they don't go wrong in government, at the next election those people won't need to vote tactically and they'll come back to Labour. So that's an interesting analysis. What I would say, just for balance, is that there is, because of the nature of their coalition, they kind of face a similar problem to what Boris Johnson had in 2019, which was he had so many different types of voters that he had to try and keep happy. It was almost impossible to do that. And I think we're already starting to see, within a month of Labour being in government, the potential problems with that, because this week we had Rachel Reeves going out and trying to kill the Tories, as the Times says, by almost using George Osborne's strategy against the Tories by painting them as being reckless with the economy and saying that she'd inherited the worst set of finances since the Second World War. But the problem is that her response to that was then to cut a number of things, to cut a number of benefits. And one of those things was the winter fuel allowance for millions of pensioners. She's also scrapped the income cap on social care. Now, these things will appeal to certain voters, and I think Labour is strongest with the under 50s, and that's probably their core demographic. But it will inevitably, there's always losers in politics, and I think the more they have to make tough decisions, the more people they're going to upset. So this idea that they can kill the Conservative Party, I think it's a very tall order, and in politics I just don't think it's possible.